Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England, whose purpose is to uncover and promote authors with new ideas to society's oldest problems, especially economic ones. Hello, I'm your host, Jonathan Brown. Today we continue our miniseries celebrating the second edition of Taken for a Ride, Don Riley's classic work on land values and how well-designed public projects such as the Jubilee Line, of which Don was a major beneficiary, always end up in the land price. Today we're speaking with Steve Norris, the former Transport Secretary who forced the Treasury to invest in the extension, and incidentally got Crossrail approved back in 1997. Steve was kind enough to be interviewed for the book, and in there he doesn't hold back in his criticisms of the Treasury, and he does the same in this interview. As way of background, Steve grew up in Liverpool, studied at Oxford, and then began a career in engineering and in the motor industry. In the 1970s, he began a dual career as a politician, eventually serving as an MP in Margaret Thatcher's government, and then as Minister for John Major. He was Transport Secretary from 1992 to 1997, pushing through the investment in the Jubilee Line Extension, after which time he stepped down from politics to return to his business career. Today, he's a chairman and senior advisor to a number of different companies and charities and leads a small but highly skilled team of people who specialise in complex property, infrastructure and transportation projects around the world. He's also co-director of a business that builds more affordable homes for people in and around his adopted city, London. Now, in this conversation, Steve begins his jokes and banter right before the interview is due to start, so I've decided to go from there. Where are you today?
I'm in my office, which is in Soho Estates. So it's top of Charing Cross Road, near the Tottenham Court Road tube station.
Brilliant.
This includes the Elizabeth Line, or Crossrail as it was known when I first took the bill through Parliament in 1995. It opened only 27 years later, so a wonderful track record for HM Treasury.
I'd like Let's get started, Steve, and then we could get into that if that's all right. I just want to I'd just like to start off with just how you got to become Transport Minister, how you got into what caused you to focus on the Jubilee Line Extension, how great an investment it's been, and then kick as hard as you like on the Treasury, and then anything around. I looked into some of your stuff around your property infrastructure, land deals, helping sanctuary homes with the building more affordable homes for people. Yeah. And it's really just getting that balance, and anything that you'd like to say about Don's book or and that kind of stuff. I just get the impression when I reading about you and Don is that I think you'd really got on, and
he was my kind of guy. I love the fact that he said I paid a lot of tax during my time in the UK because, I was a very successful property developer. But then along came the Jubilee Line Extension, and I sold the two buildings that were impacted in Bermondsey and got all my money back.
Yeah.
Well, it's just typical, No, he was obviously a player. I mean, I generally speaking, I did read the book, and it's obviously it's got different sort of chapters. It's quite unusual in some senses because it's it's a whole series of propositions, which generally I think by the importance of big infrastructure, the desperate need for more housing, and frankly, the terrible drag anchor that the UK Treasury is, which, of course, is largely what constituted the piece that you wrote about, effectively almost a copy of what you and I had discussed, and my words on that. I do think this is a huge problem, and before I start, if you like, on the JLE specifically, it is worth saying that Harold Wilson created the Department of Economic Affairs in, if you remember, the 60s, when Labour first came to power, because as an economist, he knew that the Treasury, is an anachronism, frankly. He created the Department of Economic Affairs. He put George Brown in charge. George wasn't really up to it. He was already having a lot of personal problems. And a couple of years later, the department was just killed off by the Treasury. But that was a disaster. I often say to people when talking about this, what do you think's on that brass plaque on the front door of 10 Downing Street? What do you think it says? Everybody could see the plaque. Does it say Office of the Prime Minister? Does it say Prime Minister? Does it say 10 Downing Street? Brackets, no circulars? No, it says First Lord of the Treasury. Never forget that in the UK, the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is a Treasury Minister. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury is a Treasury Minister. The Chief Whip is a Treasury Minister. He's the political secretary to the Treasury. Senior whips are all Lords Commissioners of the Treasury. Putting it in simple terms, we are run not by Downing Street, not by 10 Downing Street, but by 11 Downing Street, by the Treasury. The archetype of that, I suppose, was Gordon Brown, who refused to show the budget to Tony Blair that he was going to deliver the next day. And it was basically a power struggle. If I'd been Tony Blair, I'd have fired him on the spot and said, I'll get somebody else to do it. I'll deliver it myself. Just send the document over so I can redline it. But, we've got a system in which the Treasury is a terrible drag anchor on so much of the progress that we need in this country. And, the very well-known joke that Liam Byrne left his successor when Labour left office in 2010 was that wonderful line, "Dear Chief Secretary, I'm sorry there's no money. Yours ever, Liam." Now, actually, in a rather cynical way, David Laws, who was briefly the Chief Secretary, saw this as a terrible admission of guilt and an insult and a reflection on how appalling Labour had been in government. Actually, I think that was nonsense. Gordon Brown should get credit for the fact that in many ways, in 2008, he was the world's most prominent advocate of the solution to the banking crisis, which was certainly not caused by him or the UK. No, the point about "I'm sorry there's no money" is that it was a standing joke. What Treasury ministers will do, when you went in to see the Chief Secretary, and he or she was the person that you spoke to when you had a capital project to negotiate, like the Jubilee Line Extension or Crossrail, they would say, "Oh, it's a terrific idea, Steve. Gosh, yes. We really love it. It's marvellous. But you do know there's no money. I'm really, really sorry. We'd love to do this. It's a great, great, great project, but I'm afraid there's no money." And actually the answer is, of course there's money. When every new coming Prime Minister says we will borrow to invest, not just to prop up public spending. Well, they say it, and in all honesty, they probably want to believe it. But none of them, Labour or Tory, pay the slightest notice of that. The reality is they just say no.
Yeah. And I know so as Transport Minister in 92, working under John Major in his government, you then get the brief where there's the Jubilee Line Extension has been bouncing around
since the 50s.
Goodness me. And yet you managed to get it approved, and it's now become, I don't know if you saw the KPMG and the Savills assessment. It's just been the most transformational project in London that we can see. And in terms of positives, I mean, it's whether the M25 is more impactful, don't know. But in terms of an investment in London and what the Jubilee Line Extension led to, not just the transformation of the area, the possibility of having the Olympics in 2012, it is, in my opinion, that the defining investment in London. And yet, I mean, as you talk about in the book, you had to threaten to resign and then and severely embarrass John Major if you didn't find money for what turns out to be a fabulous investment that it really ought to have been. This is great. What else could you, if we gave you, that the kind of thing, it's like, well, we'll give you $3.5 billion for this, but if we gave you $5 billion, what else could we do? That kind of creative thinking that you'd really need. So would you just tell our listeners just how so you became minister in 92, and then how you got what you saw in the Jubilee Line Extension, and then how you managed to get it through?
Well, first of all, no minister does it on their own. They always have to have superb people, civil servants, who are dedicated to the ministerial program and to help you deliver it. And I had wonderful help from my senior team in the department, who were as keen as I was on the obvious merits of the project, which was not just the Jubilee Line, just let's set the background. The Jubilee Line used to stop at Charing Cross via Green Park. And the idea was to not go to Charing Cross, but to go from Green Park to Westminster, to then go from Westminster round to Waterloo, and then go south of the river all the way through to the point at which we go north, and we go through what was then Canary Wharf to the Greenwich Peninsula, and then back through to Stratford. I mean, a fantastic opportunity to link a whole series of massively undervalued parts of London, which were largely empty because a lot of them were actually linked to the river, places like Canada Water and the Surrey canals, because they were former. They were actually sort of former shipping-related areas which hadn't ever been regenerated since. The process was firstly to make sure we understood the value of the line. So every single station had to prove its worth. And I didn't think that was a very difficult job, actually, although the Treasury did. The Treasury would say, what's the point of building Canada Water? Because nobody lives there. The famous lines about Surrey Canal Minister, it's not in Surrey and there's no canal. Well, yeah, got all that. But the reality is that what they never, ever even bothered to think about was build it and they'll come. Now, some of the bravest developers of real estate all over the world have made big mistakes saying build it and they'll come, and sometimes they do and maybe sometimes they don't. But when you think of the areas we were talking about, places like Southwark and Bermondsey and Canada Water, as we go along east to south of the river, there was such obvious massive potential for housing, for development, for upgrading the whole area, making it possible for people in those parts of London to access jobs in the city and the West End, which previously would have been very difficult for them. It was pretty obvious that there would be a great return on the Treasury's investment. And of course, you mentioned the Olympics, but to be fair, Jonathan, the Olympics weren't thought of when we were designing it. The Olympics were, of course, the brainchild of Ken Livingstone, the first mayor of London, and one of the greatest things that he achieved. It was still the greatest mayor we've had so far, and by a country mile. But there was an obvious logic about every single one of the stations, and we believed that the process of acquiring the site would be the next most difficult. I'm referring, of course, to things like the North Greenwich Peninsula, which was described to me by the Treasury as a contaminated coaling site. In fact, it was owned by British Gas. It was indeed contaminated, but not a problem for us because we were going to excavate, obviously, a huge amount of it in order to build the North Greenwich Station. And when you look now at a place which is accommodating up to 25,000 homes, the O2, parts of a university, massive retail area these days, just shows you it's a kind of classic example of the potential that the Jubilee Line actually opened up. And then when you look at going through to Stratford itself, you've already said this, Jonathan, but it's hugely important. I always used to think of the east of London as on one of those old medieval maps where it said, here dragons lie, I mean, nobody went east, you just didn't. It goes back to the reason why it's always the east of the great cities of Europe where poor people live. And it's, of course, because in the days before Mr. Crapper and the invention of the modern toilet, night soil, as it was euphemistically called, both human and, of course, equine, because transport would have been by horse, used to be carted up and pushed east, because the prevailing wind came from the west, and does, of course, throughout Europe. So all the major cities in Europe, the old medieval cities, Paris is a classic example, Berlin, Madrid, the east of the city is the poor side. And of course, ironically, once it is the poor side, it's the side that nobody does want to live. And the massive difference between the east and the west of London was summed up by the average per capita GDP of the city, if you divided it by a line going north-south via Blackfriars, let's say. Because on the west, Londoners living west of that line have, on average, 4 times national average per capita GDP. On the east of that line, they have 0.75 of national average per capita GDP. In other words, they're actually below the national average. And when you think of how expensive it is, nonetheless, to live east of London, because you're still paying a lot of London prices, that's why 6 of the poorest boroughs in Britain are in London.
All right.
People living outside London don't believe you when you say it, but it's true. And it's because actually so much is very expensive still east of my line, my arbitrary line, but it's a pretty good arbiter of the difference. But of course, wages, even if they are a bit bigger than they might be in, say, Coventry or Liverpool, still don't get anywhere near, making these people well off. It is a very poor area. And it was obvious to me and to, I might say, all of my colleagues, they opened my eyes to just what a fantastic difference we could make with the JLE. Anyway, we went through the process. It's pretty well known these days that the Treasury tried to, if you like, stop the project by saying that now that at the point at which Olympia in York, the Rifleman's development vehicle had gone into administration because of the terrible recession at the time, that we would have to deal with 14 creditor banks. And I think this is kind of typical of the Treasury's failings, because if you asked any developer whether they'd like to take a stake in Canary Wharf with the Jubilee Line Extension built, they'd have bitten your arm off up to the elbow. Of course they would. Only the Treasury thought that somehow this would be a handicap. And I've often thought it reflected your classic Treasury mindset that, why would you buy anything that isn't an instant gold bar? We suffice to say we talked to the 14 creditor banks. We added in the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who made a contribution, much irritating the Treasury, I might say, and got it over the line. And when it was literally at the point at which we'd answered all the questions, and I'd said to the then Chief Secretary, Michael Portillo, I don't see there's anything else we need to do. I did say, and I made it very, very clear, that if we didn't get it, we'd managed to get the Prime Minister to make a number of statements about how wonderful the Jubilee Line Extension would be, and if he didn't sign it off, I would resign, and I would make a hell of a fuss about how you can't trust the government. Because I felt very, very, very strongly about it, that it was the Treasury who were the real, if you like, opponents of progress. Anyway, of course, as always happens with these things, Ken Livingstone didn't actually get to see the opening of the Olympics in 2012. I didn't actually get to see the opening of the Jubilee Line Extension in 2000, because by then the Labour government was in charge. But you're right that it's a massive benefit. And, I do travel on it from time to time. And, of course, the idea of protecting people from possibility of falling onto the line was new. That's the first time we've done that. That'll be a feature of every new railway that we build, and of course it's a feature of the Liz line. I think the stations are wonderful. Roland Paoletti, who was the consultant architect on the project, said, I'm not just going to build a box. I'm going to build stations that will live for 500 years. And you look at things like Canary Wharf or North Greenwich, or even if you go to Killington, where you've got 3 railways on 3 heights, or the Stratford station itself. They're all wonderful stations. I love Westminster Station. It's a fantastic engineering achievement.
I think that's my favourite. I still remember the first time I went to Westminster Station, and just the feeling of awe that and as a contrast to what were really quite dirty and dank places, until then. And then you came into what looked to be a cathedral of movement. Just breathtaking stuff.
Breathtaking, yeah. So there we go. And I think it's wonderful. It was great to be involved and great to get it moving. And incredibly frustrating not to be there to cut the ribbon, not for grandiose reasons, but just you can imagine when you've been involved in a job like that, you hand it over to somebody else. Well, I'd have loved to have kept it going. But nonetheless, I think a fantastic addition to London's transport infrastructure. And as you say, probably, certainly until the Liz line came along, the most significant improvement in public transport connectivity for a century.
Yeah, and I was wondering really just what satisfaction, if any, you take from being right about the JLE, which did come through, but Crossrail, you were pushing for that in the 90s, and got turned down, and then the Labour government sat on their hands for over a decade, and only now we've got it. And I look at the numbers on Crossrail, the Liz line, and by every definition, if you take in Don's assertion of the gain is in the land, you look at the gains along there, it's paid for itself already.
Yeah, of course it has.
And yet we had to wait 3 decades to get it done.
Absolutely. 27 years to be precise, between my taking it through in 1995 and it opening in 2022. That's it. 27 years, just quite incredible, but symptomatic of the way we deal with big infrastructure. Because the merits of it were blindingly obvious. In fact, what's interesting is we didn't factor in Terminal 5 in 1995 because it wasn't built at that time. It was subject itself to a 10-year-long planning process, if you remember it. But I don't think anybody at that stage appreciated how significant traffic from Heathrow into, not just, into Paddington, but Paddington, the West End, Midtown, City, Docklands, and then on south of the river or north. It's been phenomenal. I was privileged to be a director of Excel for a number of years, and until only about 18 months ago, actually. And I can tell you that it's been transformational for Excel. Why is that good? Well, it's great for Britain because it brings so many, people to London with big wallets and lots of spending going on in the West End. And, the line, of course, means, I remember the chief executive saying to one of the senior people who was bringing 3,000 veterinarians from America or whatever it was, saying to the chief exec, don't get a limo, get the Liz line, get the Elizabeth line. If you take a limousine from Heathrow to us, it'll take you, what do you reckon it would take, Jonathan? 3 hours to get from there to,
to Lucky Town.
Take the Liz line, you'd be there in 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Done. And what's more, guaranteed, comfortable, no problem at all. So that's sort of, those big projects are the ones that, I desperately believe we ought to have a much better sort of approach to than we do. We've got one at the moment in London, which I'm personally passionate about, which is the extension of the Bakerloo line down the Old Kent Road and through New Cross and out into Kent. I mean, the Old Ken Road still is the poorest place to stop on the Monopoly board, you know. And when you go there, it's still very, very poor. It has some very disadvantaged communities in it. You only have to drive down it to see exactly what I'm saying. You'll no doubt know it. That's not even a massively expensive project these days, and the benefits of it would be enormous. And yet it's stalled completely, somewhere between the Mayor of London and the Treasury. But, you know, should we be doing it? We can't afford not to be doing it if we want a civilized city to live in. And yet it will take, I guarantee, it'll take years. I doubt very much whether I'll be alive to see it out. And I think that's utterly tragic. And I think we have the solution in our own hands. And governments so far, in my entire political experience over 40 years, have never bothered to actually, you know, pick up the challenge and run with it in the way that they should. And the way that the French and the Germans and others do. That's the point.
Yeah. And then, so just on that, then let's imagine that you were, and I'm guessing you wouldn't, but if you were managed to be persuaded to come back as Transport Minister, what would you change?
Oh, well, I mean, what I'd actually want to do is to really strongly advance the case in Cabinet for these major projects, not just for the sake of building them, but because they enable so much more economic and social development to take place in a city that's straining at the seams, that, you know, you get massive benefit out of this. It's not about spending, it's not about building for the sake of building. It's not about building in order to stand in huge tunnels like the new Tideway tunnel, which is an astonishing achievement and one of the greatest achievements this country has had since the war, without a shadow of a doubt. But doing it because it makes London a much better city to live in, and surely that's our responsibility. You know, London is arguably the greatest city in the world. Despite all its disadvantages, I love being here. But the fact is, it could be so much better, and it should be. It's a real priority. So that's what I would press. And, you know, if you said, what would you not spend money on? Well, as it happens, I wouldn't build a Stonehenge tunnel. I think it's some nonsense. I'd save several £billion doing that. I wouldn't build any more smart motorway. I think that was a dreadful mistake, which I'd want to unwind as quickly as possible, and I don't think National Highways is doing that quickly enough at all. But don't start me, because it's a long list.
Is there anything that you'd like to, just on insights into Don's approach to, and his ideas as a property developer, saying I've made too much money and this wasn't my money?
Yeah, I mean, but Don, sometimes developers, property owners get lucky because somebody says, I need your building and I'm prepared to pay you for it, and they pay a market price. And if you're a shrewd developer, you make sure you get well paid, and that's very good. There are other developers who see value before it's actually arrived. And I'm thinking of, for example, people who bought 10 years ago in Slough, knowing that actually one of these days the Elizabeth line was going to run through that town and actually create there a massive opportunity for people to live very close to the countryside in Buckinghamshire and Berkshire, but actually be able to access Paddington, West End, City, Docklands very, very easily. The Liz line really is transformational in that sense. So going back to Don's point, he makes it very clear that in part he was lucky, but he also then makes the case for saying that land value is the key to the logic for many of these projects. It's opening up their opportunity value, if you like, because instead of being a building that's sterile and therefore only of interest if you want to, buy something cheap, into something that actually is connected much better to the fabric of London, so opens up many more opportunities for the people without jobs to the jobs without people. And that was always my mantra about the Jubilee Line Extension, getting the people without jobs to the jobs without people, because that's always one of the big problems of big cities. You look at Bombay. I was in Bombay, oh gosh, it must be a decade ago now, but I was struck by, the first time I've been to India, and struck by this incredible difference between the huge sort of shanty town, which you see as you approach on an aircraft, and the luxury hotels in the expensive part of the city. And what's the key to that? It's access. It's all about access.
Yeah.
If there's no access, you are marooned. You're forced to look in instead of being able to look beyond. That's what was happening in the east of London. Doesn't happen anymore. People are moving out, for example, where they have children. Couples are moving to places like Newham, where they can buy a really nice 3-4 bedroom house for a price which wouldn't get you a 2-bedroom flat anywhere near central London. But they can get into central London, they can get into Docklands, and they can even get into West London very, very easily on a piece of infrastructure. I mean, QED.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything more you'd like to say before we wrap up, Steve?
No, I mean, I think the book is a great addition to what's actually a complex argument about profitability in the infrastructure sector. It can mean that I bought a building for £1 million and sold it for 10 because it happened to be the one building that the developer needed, the government needed in order to, and that's great. But then on the other hand, all developers take enormous risks. Many of them, incidentally, including many construction companies, have gone broke over the last couple of years because they gave fixed prices or they assumed selling prices before the impact of the pandemic, working from home, AI, and so on. It's still a tough game where only the good survive, only the really competent survive. But on the other hand, land, particularly on a constrained island like ours, is so significant a commodity that arguments about how it should be taxed, who should own it, why they should own it, and whether they should own it, will, I suspect, go on forever.
Brilliant. Steve, well, thanks very much for your service. One thing that just in closing just stands out is the fairness that you've clearly had as a business person, but also as a politician. And I don't think there'll be many former Conservative MPs who would praise Ken Livingstone. But also giving credit where it's due, really. And I think I don't see many politicians like you anymore. Unfortunately, I think we're much poorer for it. So, thank you very much for what you've done and for delivering with your team such an amazing, an amazing energizer to London that was the Jubilee Line Extension.
Very kind of you. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that, mate. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Bye.
Cheers, bye-bye. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit Shepheard-Walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers, and also to buy the books. So until next time, keep reading.